If someone with schizophrenia or severe depression breaks the law, are they morally responsible? Should a court punish them? In Jewish law, the answer isn't always yes. There's a legal category that's never punished in a Jewish or Noahide court, the Shoteh, often translated as insane, though as you'll see, that term doesn't capture its full depth. So who exactly falls into this category? What kind of behaviors or mental states make someone exempt from divine and legal responsibility? According to Jewish tradition, 3 kinds of people are not obligated to keep the 7 universal laws. The Katan, a minor, the Cheresh, a deaf mute, which we'll get into in the next video, and the Shoteh, our focus today. But what do all these categories share? All 3 are presumed to lack da'at, which in Hebrew roughly translates to moral understanding, the inner capacity we have to discern good from evil. However, before we define who qualifies as a Shoteh, it's essential to clarify that this is a purely legal category. It's not a judgment of worth or dignity. All of God's creations are valuable. The law, though, is only limiting liability, not human value. So let's get into it. Liability and punishment depend on one major thing: moral understanding. We find in the Bible that Adam and Eve are not punished until they actually have knowledge of good and evil, this moral understanding. Similarly, our human courts should act on this basis. The Oral Torah uses this principle to classify certain people who are presumed to lack this moral understanding, and would thus not be liable to punishment if they transgress a law. Importantly, Maimonides, the chief codifier of Noahide law, doesn't differentiate between a Jewish Shoteh and a non-Jewish Shoteh. A Shoteh is a legal category that applies to both. In general, a Shoteh is somebody who is past the ages of 13 for boys and 12 for girls, puberty, who lacks moral understanding. Someone who lacks the intellectual and moral capacity to make meaningful decisions, discern right from wrong, good from evil, and to understand consequences. Ultimately, in a Noahide or Jewish society, the judge decides whether someone falls into the category of Shoteh. Of course, psychologists and psychiatric diagnoses can provide valuable insights, but the judge has the ultimate authority. But how can a judge know if someone lacks moral understanding? First, we'll go over what the Talmud says, then Maimonides, and then later authorities. The Talmud, part of the Oral Torah, asks, who's a Shoteh? They say, a Shoteh is one who goes out alone at night, one who sleeps in a cemetery, one who tears one's clothing, or one who destroys whatever is given to him. We take this as examples of what a Shoteh may do. It's not an exhaustive list. And to clarify, if a person goes out alone at night with a valid reason, or has a valid reason to tear one's clothing, this person's not a Shoteh. It's only if the person performs these actions irrationally. What these examples attempt to portray, though, are irrational or dangerously erratic behaviors that demonstrate a lack of rationality. Remember, to even arrive at the base level of Noahide law, you have to have rationality. A lack of rationality shows a potential to perhaps lack moral understanding. Now, Maimonides in his Mishnah Torah uses other examples for defining a Shoteh. He says, a Shoteh isn't just someone who walks around naked, destroys utensils, and throws stones, but rather a Shoteh is one whose mind is continuously disturbed and confused, to the point where they cannot function in society or comprehend basic aspects of reality. Today, we might say that this person has a mental illness or cognitive disability to the point of lacking moral agency and thus legal responsibility. So far, we've defined the Shoteh broadly. Now let's refine it. Later Jewish authorities say that the Shoteh can fall into 3 categories, which are essentially based on the degree and severity of one's Shotehness, and each is treated differently. But 2 points that we should know before we move on to these categories. The classification of a Shoteh isn't just based on mental states themselves, but on behavior. The mental state may explain the behavior, but the ultimate judgment comes down to how that person acts. And second, the actions must be at least as odd as those actions that were delineated in the Talmud. If not, the person can't be classified as a Shoteh. Okay, so the first category of Shoteh is a Shoteh Gamur, roughly the completely insane. Somebody who experiences mental confusion over a wide range of thought and conduct. This Shoteh Gamur is who we typically mean when we say Shoteh. Today, this might describe someone with severe schizophrenia, chronic psychosis, or maybe even advanced dementia. It's a person who's unable to distinguish fantasy from reality. Notably, these people are not obligated to keep the Noahide commandments. The second category is Shoteh le'itim, insane at times. Basically, someone who alternates between rational and irrational states. Today, these people may be those with bipolar disorder, with manic episodes, or perhaps those with epilepsy or seizure-related episodes, perhaps other schizoaffective disorders. Now, it's interesting here. These people are obligated to keep the Noahide commandments when they're in their rational state, but they aren't obligated to keep the Noahide commandments when they're in those psychotic episodes. The judge would then have to recognize whether they were in this state if they committed a transgression. And the third category is Shoteh ledavar echad, insane in one matter. Basically, someone rational in everything except for one area. Perhaps they're fixated on a paranoid delusion or something like that. Like maybe they're irrationally convinced that they're being poisoned or spied on, but otherwise completely rational. For these people, obligation is more nuanced. Some authorities understand Maimonides to take the strict position that someone who is mentally confused in one area may be confused in a lot of other areas. How can we assume that their confusion doesn't just spread to all other areas and we only perceive them as being rational? However, others, such as the Ravid and the Tosafot, argue that these people may indeed be competent in all other areas, and thus they cannot be treated equally as a Shoteh Gemor. The modern consensus is that the judge should try to determine competence per domain. Without getting into too much detail, perhaps a transgression in that paranoid delusion may be weighted differently than in other areas that this person shows competence in. Now, before we close, I want to point out one crucial distinction. Being a Shoteh is not the same as having low intelligence or lacking education. Slow learning does not mean a lack of moral understanding. However, it's true that maybe some people with extreme forms of low intelligence could end up being classified as Shoteh if they show the symptoms that we mentioned earlier. Likewise, someone struggling with depression, anxiety, perhaps emotional turmoil is not a Shoteh unless, of course, they act in those ways that demonstrate a loss of rationality, like sleeping in graveyards or destroying people's property without reason. Remember, it's all about behavior because we can't just dig into somebody's brain and know whether or not they have this moral understanding. Perhaps in some future video, I will delve more into this because it does fascinate me what this da'at, this moral understanding, really means and whether we could actually test for it. But perhaps it really just does boil down to behavior. To close, the Torah recognizes each individual's human dignity. It is said that God does not make unfair demands from his creatures. Remember that moral agency, moral knowledge, is the precondition for accountability in the Seven Noahide Laws. And a Shoteh is thus not obligated. In general, the Shoteh is not merely just the insane, but someone whose grasp of reality is so impaired that they no longer possess moral understanding, or da'at, that awareness that makes us moral beings. The sages didn't create this Shoteh category to stigmatize anybody, but to protect them, to ensure that we don't punish people who can't understand. God's system interweaves justice with mercy. In the next video, we'll look at the last category that is said to lack moral understanding, the deaf mute. So subscribe to stay tuned for that. I hope you enjoyed, learned something. As always, thank you for participating and watching. See you guys next week.